Thank you very much, Art. Happy Sabbath, everybody. Happy Sabbath. Start off with an easy question. How many of you have seen the movie The Sting? We'll do raise of hands, starring Paul Newman. I've never seen it. I just raised my hand for the example. One, because I don't watch many movies, and two, because the movie was 25 years old when I was born. Sorry to date all of you for that one. But I wanted to start to paint a middle picture, and for those of you who haven't seen the movie The Sting, it still holds in modern culture and shows up in many different movies and TV shows. It's usually two people standing on opposite ends of the room wearing a full brim cap. They're kind of flashing baseball signs to each other, right? And there's always this music in the background that's and usually those two people are getting ready to perform a grift. Of course, grifting is a glamorized word for stealing, but justifying it because you're smarter than the person you're stealing from. In fact, grifting is normally portrayed as petty theft or a series of petty thefts that lead up to a big, grand finale. Sort of like a snowball effect. The small pots that you win at the beginning, you kind of grow larger and larger until you're trying to steal that one big thing. The problem with that gaining momentum is that you're usually moving so quickly and so hastily that you're blinded by the things around you at the end, and that big ploy may end up going sideways. Most people will watch this movie and laugh along because the character that Paul Newman plays is so good at tricking people that the viewer starts to believe that he deserves to get those things that he's stealing. The viewer starts to believe that he's so smart and so witty that he can do whatever he wants. But some people watch the movie and think, he stole $100, and he stole $500, and then he stole $500,000. He's breaking at least 4 of God's commandments right now, you know. The glamorization of Hollywood makes grifting funny and cute, but it's really just glorifying the work of Satan in humans. Let's turn over in our Bibles and discuss a story and character evolution that shows this impact that Satan had. This character we'll talk about today is Judas. Judas is a very interesting character in the Bible. He's discussed narratively in the Gospels and Acts. However, because the Gospels are presumed to be written by people who aren't Judas, there's not much to say about him throughout the telling of Jesus Christ's life, except for, of course, a few big events, right? Although the conclusion can be drawn that Judas spent close to about 3 years with Jesus and the 12 apostles, and the assumption can be made that there have been plenty of one-on-one conversations with Jesus, none of those interactions are documented in the Bible. The only interactions documented are in large groups of people. I was able to find 6 significant events that tell us a little bit of what Judas was like in the Bible. I'm not going to go through all 6 events in much detail, but I will touch on each of them to show what we know about Judas and his snowball effect and eventual downfall. Let's go to the earliest example of Judas in the book of John, chapter 6 and verse 68 through 71. John 6, 68. What's interesting about the story of Judas is how the different Gospels describe his actions and intentions. While in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's primarily a historical view of Judas, in John, it has a little bit more insight into the intentions of Judas on top of the descriptions of him. John chapter 6, verse 68. But Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered them, Did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil? He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12. We know from the beginning of their relationship that Jesus recognized evil in Judas. So why would Jesus bring Judas into his inner circle? Of his multitude of disciples and followers, he chose Judas of his description of devil, to be one of his 12 apostles. One of the 12 that he gave the power over unclean spirits and diseases. I'm sure that there's ways that we as humans can try to justify the way that he did that. Maybe he wanted to figure out through man the evils of the world. There could be different psychological explanations, but I don't really think that's the case. I think that the Word and the Father don't really need reassurance from a human being, a reason as to why the world hates the Holy Family. Jesus and the Father know exactly what they were doing when they included Judas in their plan. However, they also knew from the start that Judas had evil inside of him. I'm worried I'm going to mess up Jesus and Judas because their names are so similar. Let's go over to the next significant moment in the Judas Chronicles, and this will stay in John, but in chapter 12. John chapter 12, verse 1. And this is a story that's documented not only in John, but also in the books of Matthew and Mark. And it's titled The Anointing at Bethany. So John chapter 12, verse 1, and we'll read 1 through 7. Then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Then he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box and used to take what was put in it. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you will have with you always, but me you will not have with you always." I only point out that this was also documented in Matthew and Mark because in Matthew it says, "But when the disciples saw this waste, they were furious." In Mark it says, "But there were some people who said, 'Why are you wasting? We're mad about that.'" But in John, the writer of John comes out and says that Judas is at least the loudest of those who complained. He was the one who complained of the supposed waste, and it added the supporting fact that Judas was also a thief. So at this point, we know that not only Judas is described by Jesus as a devil, but we also know that he likes to take coin out of the savings for the poor for himself. Now let's scroll down just one more chapter to John 13. It's John 13, and we'll go to verse 21. It's John 13 and verse 21. We'll look at the next significant happening of Judas and John. And I'll read through verse 30. John 13, verse 21. When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Most assuredly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." Then the disciples looked at one another perplexed about whom he spoke. At this point, the disciples aren't saying, "Oh, it's definitely Judas. That guy's just an evil guy." No, they're very confused, and they don't know who would betray the one who they all believe in and trust in, Jesus Christ. Verse 23, now there was, leaning on Jesus' bosom, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was of whom he spoke. Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is he whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." But no one at the table knew what reason he said this to him. For some thought because Judas had the money box that Jesus said to him, "Buy those things and we need for the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. Having received the piece of bread, he went out immediately, and it was night. Of course, we already know, as the reader, that Jesus is knowing of Judas's intentions. However, what's really interesting is, again, the other disciples didn't understand. They didn't know the intentions of Judas. They saw him as another apostle. They saw him as another believer and follower of Jesus Christ, and not as someone who would betray Jesus. Nobody thinks, oh, it's definitely Judas. He's an evil guy. They just think, oh, Jesus Christ just needed a little bit more food for the supper. Judas definitely knows that Jesus is talking about him early on, because it says earlier in this chapter, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So although Satan already puts evil into Judas's heart, now at this point it is described as Satan entering him, and he hurries off to betray Jesus. Now let's turn over to the final 3 points of Judas's story, and I'll just be scrolling through Matthew 26 and 27 for these final parts of the story. You can follow along or listen, but we all know how it ends. So Matthew chapter 26, and I'll start in verse 14. Matthew 26, 14 through 16. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give to me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. So at this point we know that Judas is described as a devil. He is known for stealing. He has Satan in his heart, and he also has the greed to betray Jesus Christ. Now let's move down to verses 47 through 49. That's still Matthew chapter 26, verse 47. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him." Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Then knowing, accepting, and regretting all that he had done, down in chapter 7, Judas hanged himself before he had to face Jesus on the cross. I purposely lengthened the beginning of this story and went quickly through the end because that's how I imagined Judas's life going. He left his family, his house, all that he had, and went to follow Jesus as one of the 12 apostles. Although he apparently was already a crooked person when he joined Christ's discipleship, a regular person was not able to see that. Each of those 12 apostles assumed that all of them were fully faithful to Jesus. But he was identified as a devil early on by Jesus. Then we found out about his stealing and his intent to betray Jesus, and his greed of money becoming more powerful than his trust in Jesus Christ. And now Judas's name is always described as Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Judas is just one example of somebody who is completely taken by Satan's long-term grift. Satan started with the little things. Maybe you take a couple pieces of money, right? Maybe you take a few more. Maybe 30 pieces of silver is worth the betrayal of Jesus Christ. Judas fell captive to the seemingly appealing short-term plan and quote-unquote rewards that Satan offered him. We as human beings can easily fall captive to the seemingly appealing short-term plan of Satan. But you and I have to be aware of the little things, the white lies, the covetousness, the draw of Satan, and nip it in the bud. You and I cannot fall trap to Satan's long-term grift.